Hey everybody, it sounds like we're about ready to go. So why don't I start? So the name of the talk is A Guiler's Year of Racket. My name's Christopher Lammer Weber. You can see how to get in contact with me there, et cetera, et cetera. So, I've been doing, I got into Guile a number of years ago. 2014, I guess, where I wrote this blog post where I was really excited because I read the section of the Guile manual that talked about the compiler tower, and I was sick of writing two different languages, both JavaScript on the front end, or Python on the back end, and JavaScript on the front end. And you can see how much you can disregard me knowing anything about languages, because I'm like, well, Python probably has the nicest asynchronous library development. Okay, yeah, I didn't know anything, but I got excited about Guile kind of got me excited about languages in some ways. One of the other things that really pulled me in is David Thompson wrote this cool game engine called Sly. And now he's actually working on a different game engine. But Sly was really cool. I watched this video of him running this game. And as he runs the game, he actually changes the entire game as it runs, right? He's like, oh, this character should move faster. And he just evaluates, and it does, and all those cool things like that. And I'm like, oh, why can't I be doing this? This is what I want to be doing. So... and then I got into, the usual schemer route where you get into the structure and interpretation of computer programs, and you go down this programming language rabbit hole. I found this Geeks thing and spent a whole bunch of time on it. And actually, one of the reasons I got really interested in Geeks is that I work on distributed network systems, and it turns out one of the big challenges was getting, the difficulty people had deploying things. And I'm like, Geeks will be the perfect deployment environment. And we still haven't really done Geeks deploy yet. But I also had this vision that since we can write out, since Lispy things are code that can write code, I had this vision of we could, even like make things easy for users by writing like web interfaces and GUIs and stuff like that, where you just selected the things and it could actually generate the system profile. Funny thing is I haven't actually done anything towards that, but Geeks continues to be really exciting, and I love that. I also then started to go, actually get into the network programming side of things, and wrote this thing called 8sync, which was an actor model library in Guile. Do I still have this thing plugged in? Yeah, it is. Okay. All right. Some of you may remember I gave a presentation here about it a couple years ago where I actually had a game on the screen, and the audience were, until I had network problems, were able to log into the game and walk around with me while I showed the game. And what was really cool is, kind of along the lines of what, David Thompson originally pulling me in, I was able to change things. I said, okay, what do you want in the world? And then people would suggest things, and I was able to change the world as it ran. And this was really exciting to me. I also, some of you may know, I work on decentralized network protocols, that most famously ActivityPub, which is used by Mastodon and a bunch of other things. And I actually used Guile for, the reference implementation of ActivityPub. Nobody ran this software but me. And it didn't even have a client in the web interface. You actually had to open up the Guile REPL and start a API client there that you started making posts to the network and stuff like that. But, it was all in Guile, and it got us through the standards process. Guile, my home. I'm a Guiler for life, right? Right? So, and I remember I had this conversation with Wingo, and and this is my vague memory of this on IRC. He's like, oh, what if we kind of combined Racket and Guile? What would that mean? What would that look like? And I'm like, no way. Racket doesn't have a mutable top level. And if you want to do that thing where the game is running and you change the game while it's running, as far as I understood at the time, that was essential, right? And it still mostly is essential. And and then David Thompson was like, oh, what the fuck, sorry, I wasn't gonna swear. What the funk, Racket also has no mutable top level. And so, and he's like, and David was like, I invested all this time in it. Why would I have invested all this time in it if we were going to switch it out for a different scheme? And I'm like, yeah, this is a terrible idea, right? To be continued. There is more to this conversation. We'll come back to it. Well, my spouse is an art historian, and we were driving around, and she started to get into programming a few years ago for a project she was working on, and we were talking about how programming is so inaccessible to so many people in the humanities, but they could actually really benefit from it. And in fact, she started writing her dissertation using Racket scribble language to write her art history dissertation. And so we were like, you know, it would be really cool if we gave a workshop on how to do this. And I'm like, you know, Racket might be a good environment because they've got this text editor called Dr. Racket, and they have this, you know, markup language called Scribble. We could probably walk people through it. So we ran this workshop. We didn't even mention gender anywhere on this flyer. We basically were like, you know, this is a programming workshop for people who have, you know, imposter syndrome. 8 of the 9 people who showed up were women to this workshop. And, you know, I thought, you know, wow, this is really exciting. You know, we're getting people into it. And, you know, the back of the flyer actually had Dr. Racket with the source code on it so that you could, you know, see, you know, to entice people like, oh, you know, this is what it's going to look like. And, you know, we have these students, and what Racket has this picture language. So we actually had the students make snowmen. You know, why have a tutorial where you print out numbers and use a Fibonacci sequence and get deeply terrified about your inadequacy of understanding, you know, these concepts when you could just make snowmen, right? And using the picture language. So, and these are students' snowmen that they made in the workshop, right? And then Morgan had this thing, since she was writing her dissertation, the second part of the workshop is she had this guide on how to use Racket and Scribble to write papers in your dissertation, so that the students, so the second half of it, we would have them walk through writing this thing in Scribble, and the students would have something that they could walk away with. Even if they weren't a programmer, they still wrote papers, and they could walk out of the room and use Dr. Racket and have something that they can use, as opposed to be like, oh, I made a snowman, I don't know what to do with the rest of my life. So, you know, but like me, you know, I'm a Guiler, right? So I'm like, okay, so we're doing these Racket workshops, but I'm a Guiler, right? You know, plus there's no mutable talk level in Racket, but I'm looking into it more, and I'm like, oh, you know, this picked language is pretty cool. It's got some fun toys. Oh, you know, they've got these multiple languages things, but, you know, to be honest, I think that they don't really compose. You know, Ludovic gave a nice talk about how having a base language as actually you might want to do your composition there. And I think it's a little bit oversold. You know, that's more for language researchers, but it's nice that language exploration is really easy. Oh, man, Racket's package language has all the same problems that every mutable language package manager has, but, you know, it's also, I also don't have to set up auto tools just to be able to do, like, you know, a like two file project. And that's always been a pain for me when I write a Guile application, because I don't want to debug M4 generated shell. And, you know, these docs, you know, are actually really readable. You know, there's a lot of good tutorials, even if you're completely new. And Scribble's a lot of fun. I was having fun with it. And wow, it comes with a GUI library that just works in its platform and is actually fun. GUIs are usually the worst thing to write, and I found myself having fun writing GUIs. This is extremely unusual. And wow, there's like all these libraries. I was gonna like, I figured it was going to be like 3 years off until I could do some of the things I've been doing this year, because I figured I had to write all these libraries first in Guile. And Racket just had them. It's like the Python of Lisps. And it has like immutable hash tables in its syntax, like out of the box. It has nice generic sequences. Like, and Dr. Racket, like, we had students come who never programmed in their life ever once, and they were able to program, and they were able to leave and use the thing. And when I, you know, in Guile land, people are like, Guile's really cool, how do I get into it? I'm like, okay, first learn Emacs, you know, and then read these arcane manuals, and, you know, like here's how to use info, right? And like instead I could just point them at Dr. Racket, and they could instantly have a comparable level of ability to do cool things that I can do in Emacs. And actually, I even enjoy using it, which is never happens. And it has a good Emacs mode anyway. So, you know, I could finally get contributors to my projects who aren't Emacs users. That would be huge. So, well, something happened. So what about that immutable top level though, right? I can't, one of the things that drew me in was, you know, Sly, and I had that demo I did a couple years ago, and I can't do that. So it's not as bad as I thought. So, you know, when I heard immutable top level, I imagined the REPL would be dramatically worse. Like, you define something once, you can't really define it again, that's taken. But what happens is that Racket actually just shadows the previous REPL. And it's true, you can't redefine the previous thing. But the experience when you're playing around on the REPL is not really too different. And you can do the usual thing where you work up some code and then you copy it out of the REPL and just dump it into your file, and REPL-driven development works pretty good. And I must admit, when I would work on these things, like for example, I gave that, talk where we had that world that the audience was walking around in, and you do all these things live, and you're like, you've got a variable, you just redefine that variable, it's something different now. And you play with some things in the REPL, you define this variable in real time, and you forget to copy and paste that one in. So like when you close the session, you're like, hi, I did a great job, and you start it back up. It turns out you never actually copied that thing out of the REPL, right? So, in some ways that does make it a little bit easier. But I miss being able to use the top-level REPL for things like games and stuff like that. I do miss that. And those who have followed Racket may be familiar with the line, the top level is hopeless, which is a famous line repeated in the Racket community saying, there's no way we're going to do the immutable thing. Well, on the Racket mailing list, I mentioned that, this very story, and that I know a number of Lispers who never came to Racket, mainly because of the lack of immutable top level. And I was surprised to hear Matthias Fleisen say, I kind of regret not supporting that community, and we have limited resources, but maybe we will support that community if, we're a willingness at least to support that community. So that kind of made me be like, oh, well, maybe that's not so impossible. But Guile still has a lot of things I love, right? So there's geeks, right? I've got geeks on my shirt. I love Geeks, and I think it's an amazing project. I think it's Guile's killer application. And, there's some other nice things, too. Mace is great. Chickadee, is nice. The next, game library that David Thompson did, I really like that. And, there's quite a few others, too. And unlike, Racket's now moving on top of Shay's scheme, right? So, but what's Shay's scheme's bootstrapping story? Well, Shay's bootstrapping story is Shay's scheme. And, so we don't, in Guile at least does this thing that takes forever to compile, and then is able to bootstrap itself from that, but it compiles itself from C, and at least with Mace we have some sort of story for that. And Andy Wingo does incredible things with the compiler stuff, and I know that everybody in the community really appreciates Wingo's work, and we should all give him an applause right now, how much we appreciate that. And Andy's just like, yeah, take it. And then there's Geeks. Have I mentioned how great Geeks is, right? So what do we do? Should Guile try to catch up, right? Racket has all these things. It's a little bit embarrassing in some ways when you come back to Guile, so I don't know. It's a lot of libraries to catch up to. It's a lot of work. And the Guile community is not really big enough. Geeks has gotten, has grown Guile a lot. But, we still haven't seen too many other killer applications written in Guile. And I don't know how we can compete with Dr. Racket. To be straight up, Dr. Racket changes the ability to write a Lisp program and have people who are not Emacs users come in. That's kind of a really big deal. And I don't even know how we could get close to something that's as nice as Dr. Racket and Guile. Maybe we could try building it off of Emacs and then write all these things so that it does the nice things by default and change all the key bindings and stuff like that. But to be honest, Emacs has a lot of weird things. Killing and yanking instead of copying and pasting, these are things that have been around for a long time. So I don't know. So here's a heresy I'm going to throw out there. What would happen if we wrote Geeks on top of Racket? Right? What would happen? Oh, boo, right? So I'm just throwing it out here just to think about as a mental exercise for a moment, right? Maybe we could, just with this mental exercise, what would have happened, maybe that story about having a GUI that generates the configuration file for Racket would have happened 3 years ago, right? Because it comes with a nice GUI thing out of the box, and we're still struggling with GUI libraries in Guile land, to be honest. Maybe some sort of other things. We could get Geeks contributors who don't have to struggle to figure out how to be able to manage parentheses, So I don't know, but that seems like complete heresy. I feel like I needed to throw the heresy out there, though. So let's talk a little bit less heretical than the last slide. We can package more Racket packages than Geeks. Racket still has the classic, not great, mutable, a language environment that every other language suffers from. We can still do cool things, by bringing that there, and we can still be happy schemers. And we could maybe actually just build a Geeks GUI that's in Racket and just write out some S expressions for the component of them that are compatible, and just pull it back up in Scheme again, and maybe that would work. I've thought about doing it a few times, didn't have time to do it before this talk, but and if I remember correctly, this was the last part of the conversation. I didn't actually look at the logs before I wrote this talk. I seem to remember Wingo saying something like this, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. First of all, he's like, well, I was in the middle of giving a talk about Lisp and GNU history, and he's like, well, you were just saying in this thing about how all these Lisp communities couldn't work together, and they kept splitting, and it hurt Lisp, and the Lisp and Scheme not only diverted, but Common Lisp almost didn't happen, because Common Lisp had to pull together all of these communities who didn't really want to work together, except that they wanted to work together to survive, right? But they were, there's this famous line about, the Mac Lisp style thing has a defined direction. It's going in 5 well-defined directions, right? And, it was a lot of work to get that community to be able to, to actually work together. And so I'm like, okay, interesting point. And then Wingo said another interesting thing, if my memory is correct. What if Guile was a more interesting language for Racket to target than Shea Scheme? And I think that I must have been maybe correct about part of this, because that seems to line up with the talk you just gave. And anyway, I think that that's interesting. So, that could be really cool. And actually, it looks like the way that Racket's being architected, I've talked to them about this quite a bit. And, Matthew Flatt, I actually raised it to him at RacketCon, and he said, yeah, I'm hoping to be able to make it so that we could do those kind of things. So this could be really cool. But what are the conclusions? I love Guile, and I'm not leaving it, at least because of Geeks. At minimum, I will contribute to contribute Geeks packages, and I love doing that kind of thing. Plus, Racket still doesn't have a mutable top-level story, so it's not as much fun to write games. But, maybe my primary residence shifted, right? Both of these may be homes, but maybe, Guile's my summer house in some ways. And, Geeks is, it may sound really rich. I don't have a summer house. But, Guile and Racket also aren't enemies. I worry that this is going to bum out a bunch of people in the room. Anyway, our enemies are the not S expression using heretics, and maybe Wisp can help with that too. But there may be places where we can work together more. So let's think about that. Did I ever turn on this thing? I sure hope so. Okay, whew, I did. So anyway, thanks. I hope everybody enjoyed that. I'm open to questions. And by the way, this whole talk was actually written in Racket, in the slideshow language. You want to see the most fun part? Does anybody recognize, before I spoiler it, does anybody recognize that Running Man? 5 internet points for anybody who recognizes this character right here. No. Nope. So it's actually, so yeah, you can see the code here where I generate this. It's actually the little man that runs when you run the garbage collector in Dr. Racket. And that whole section is procedurally generated. Here's the function. It's using pict. So anyway, so yeah, any questions, or should I show demos? Demos? Okay. All right. So I mean, I bet if Ludovic felt like he wanted to do it, he could do it in a week, But I also don't want to say something that's like trying to split the community and stuff like that. I just, I think it's a worthwhile mental exercise. So anyway, I decided to try doing a little experiment and see if I could do a one-man game jam in one evening. And I wrote a version of Tetris in Racket. So and this was done in one night, right? And then the next night, some fun Unicode. I did this version. Oops. So do 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 do, and it's mostly the same code. But I thought it was really great. So I didn't have the mutable level type thing, but I could type the code and then just hit Control C, and it would reevaluate the things, and I still was able to kind of build things up at the Rebel. I just couldn't change it while it was running, and this type of program is just fine for that type of thing. Maybe not the mud type thing, but this is okay. Okay, what else have we got? Another thing, this is actually so not many people know this, but I do contracting for the U.S. House of Representatives. That's just become public somewhat recently, and we're working on, some stuff for democracy-preserving stuff so that we can actually make the voting history and all sorts of stuff like that updated in modern metadata. So maybe you want to see, what somebody's job is and stuff like this. So we've got to work on the data model for how that's going to be represented in JSON/JSON-LD, and I wrote a little tool so that you can see what the objects are going to look like and stuff like that, and this was just so that, the people that I was working with could easily generate these types of things. It's using GraphViz on the back end, but, what's nice is that, people who want to just look at a few things, because what it does is that it actually generates this giant spaghetti monster using GraphViz, because we've got so many things. So maybe you just want to look at a couple of them, so that was kind of a nice thing, and I just, that was about a day's worth of work to generate this GUI. And I mean, the other data modeling was already done in Racket, but just the GUI thing was actually pretty easy. Other things. So some of you may know that I actually just got a grant to be able to do federated work for the next couple years, and I'm going to be doing it all in Racket. And here's two servers. Here's one of the first demos of the thing called Sprightly that I'm working on. So some of you may be familiar on the Fediverse. There's a problem. What happens when one of the nodes goes down, that content disappears. This uses encrypted content addressed stuff that represents, it's spec compatible with ActivityPub, but two different servers actually can put stuff in a form that's peer-to-peer distributable between the two servers, but is secure, so that only if you end up getting the key, which is in the URI, that's used as the ID between the objects and the server, can you actually read the message. So I'm going to send a message. This is Alice's site on this tab, and this is Bob's site in this tab. I'm going to send a message to Bob, which, right now is just localhost 8001 as its address, and I'm going to be like, hi, Bob, and I'm going to hit submit. Doesn't redirect it, but you can see that in my outbox, I said, hi, Bob, and in Bob's inbox, I refresh, and we get hi, Bob. But this was not all sent in encrypted chunks that were sent across the wire that anybody can hold on to, even if a server goes down. So this is the first of the Sprightly demos that I'm going to be putting out throughout the next year. If you're more interested in Sprightly stuff, you can talk to me later. But anyway, that'll all be done in Scheme and stuff like that. So I think I'm out of time. Is that correct? Or do I have a minute? We probably have a question or so. Anybody want to ask any questions? Have I hurt everyone's feelings in the audience? Go ahead. Yeah.
So would Racket be able to do something like, can it be used as an extension language? Say if you write a program like Lilycon, can you swap?
Like the C embeddability, right? I don't know if that's going to be very good anymore. I think Racket C thing is still going to be around, but since they're moving it to be on top of Scheme, I think it's not going to be. I think that they're going to maintain that, but I think that maybe that's one thing that. Oh, right. So the question was, can you LilyPond actually embeds Guile inside of a C program? Can you do the same thing with Racket? And my impression is, you can currently. I don't think they've tried to make it as easy as Guile has historically made it. Less Guile programs seem to be going that route these days, but I think that the story for it is better currently in Guile and probably will be, especially given the trajectory of Racket. Do we have time for one more question? Okay, one more question.
What about this top level problem if you're making a mud?
Right. Okay, so here's one suggestion I got on the list that I immediately dismissed, and then I thought, okay, if the question is what would happen if I do the top level thing inside of a mud if I was going to do it in Racket? So probably the way that I would actually do it is I would actually, my current plan is actually to have in a federated mud, you would actually have a client that's also your text editor, because Racket actually comes with a GUI widget that just embeds a text editor, just like any other GUI element, right, for Scheme. So what my current plan is that, you would have the mud window where, you've got stuff coming in here where, somebody's like, like, sup, buddy, up here and stuff like that. Racket doesn't like that I'm typing, so you might have Bob is like hi up here, and I'm chatting with Bob down here, and I might be able to pull in a little GUI panel over here where I can click on an object and say I want to edit you. And what actually happens during that point? So what I'm actually going to do is make it so that scheme code will be able to execute generate a new version of the object and basically hot swap it. So you're not actually changing a variable in the same way. Instead, you have a GUI, which is your chat program, in which you're changing things. So it's not like Emacs. So one of the limitations of that MUD thing that I showed previously was that only the server administrator was able to edit objects in the system. And if we wanted to make it really cool, you want all of the players in your system to be able to edit it, which means we're going to have to be able to take it out of just the Geyser hacking world anyway, and actually consider the ability to be able to hot swap in objects. And I have a pretty good idea how to do that, and actually directly integrate it with the GUI that players are using. And so they'll have a scheme editor just built into their MUD. If this works out, who knows? Maybe I'll never get that far.
Crispy, one more question.
One more question, okay.
I was wondering, what's your primary editor now? Do you use Dr. Racket?
Oh, no way. I use Emacs with Racket mode. Absolutely. This is Emacs right here. What, are you crazy? No, Dr. Racket's great. Dr. Racket's really great. But the nice thing is that I've been able to write things with, both Geyser and Racket mode work. Racket mode is a little bit nicer for Racket. But, both of those, but they're both pretty comparable. But what's pretty nice is that I've been able to write stuff in Racket and Racket mode and then have somebody come in who's using Dr. Racket and collaborate with me. So finally, the Emacs users can get along with everyone else, which has historically not been the case, right? So yeah. Is that it?
Yep.
Thanks, everybody.